This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Bruchim Habayim. We're continuing in Mishna Berura, Daf HaShavua. We're learning Siman Lamed Beis. Yesterday we saw in Seif Chaf Aleph that every Parsha after you read it, every Parsha after you write it, you should read it well, carefully, 3 times, and then you should read it again before you put it into the bias. Seif Chaf Beis. Toiv lenasois hakolmos koidem sheyaschal lichtav haparsha. It is a good idea to test out the pen before you begin to write the parsha. Shelo yehei alav diyo yoiser midai v'yafsid. You don't want it to be leaking out too much ink, and it will ruin. V'chein yizar koidem sheyichtav kol shem. Likewise, you should be careful before you write every shem of Hashem. Likrois komash hakasav, to read over everything you wrote. You don't want it to come to have to be buried because of you. So, before you come to write Hashem's name, read over everything you wrote, because if what you wrote before wasn't good, then you'll end up having to bury it with because it has Hashem's name in it. Says the Mishna Berura, Sivkatan Kufhei. Sivkatan Kufhei. Koidem sheyaschal. Ein oratzolemer betchilas haparsha dafka. It doesn't just mean you should test the pen before the beginning of the parsha. Ela koidem sheyaschal lichtav ba'parsha. But before you begin to write in the parsha, meaning wherever you're up to, before you start to write, you should test out the pen. Masha katsav ba'oisa parsha, in that parsha, v'loi hashal lefaneha, and not before it. Meaning, before you start, you should test out the pen, and also you should be careful before you write any shame to write everything you wrote before in that parsha, but not the parsha before that. Al Yadai. Now this is an interesting halacha. When you're toivel the pen to write Hashem's name, don't write immediately, because you might ruin it with too much ink. In other words, when you dip the quill into the inkwell, don't immediately write, because at that time there's still a lot of ink dripping on it. So you want to wait a little bit and then write. Maybe there'll be a hair on it, and the ksav will not come out smoothly. You also have to sanctify the ink that's on the quill before you write Hashem's name. Therefore, you should have in mind to leave it go, one letter, meaning whenever you write Hashem's name, always leave over one letter before to write, so that when you're starting to write Hashem's name, it's not the first letter being written. And the Dirshu points out that's how you're mekadesh the ink. You're mekadesh the ink on the kumos by writing one letter before. And what v'im lo yasakein, and if you didn't do this, in other words, you didn't leave over one letter to write before you wrote Hashem's name, yichapis achar ois oitag shetzricha diyai. Look for a letter or a crown that needs some ink, v'malena, and fill it, v'koisav as Hashem. So there's an inyan that in order to ensure that Hashem's name is written properly, and in order to ensure that it's written b'kedusha, that either you leave over a letter to write before that, or you fix up a letter that needs some more ink, and by doing that, you'll make sure that when you come to writing Hashem's name, it will be with the appropriate amount of ink, and it will be niskadish. V'im tzarch diyai koydem shigmar Hashem. Well, what if you need to stick the quill back into the inkwell before you finish Hashem's name? So then the remaining letters of Hashem's name you're going to be writing with fresh ink. So the Mishna Berura says, "Oz yitbal ba'oisyo shalifnei Hashem shehim lachem." What you do is take from some of the ink of the letters of Hashem's name before that are still wet, v'yigmar Hashem. But don't dip the quill back into the inkwell. Avalo yitbal ba'oisyo Hashem atzman. Don't be toivel. Be toivel in the letters before Hashem's name that are still wet, but don't dip the pen in the letters of Hashem's name themselves. So in other words, if you need more ink, don't get the ink from the other letters of Hashem's name, get it from previous letters written. Okay, v'yesh makilin, there are those who are lenient, litbal ba'oisias Hashem atzmam, to dip it in the letters of Hashem's name themselves. To bizoy leka, it's not considered a disgrace. Kivan shu kedei lahashlam ba'yis Hashem, since it's in order to write the other letters of Hashem's name. V'im ha'oisio shalafanav einam lachin, if the letters before are not moist, azay yitbal meichadash, then you should be toivel in the inkwell again. And look for another letter or crown that needs a little bit more ink, so that when you're writing the other letters of Hashem's name, it's not with a fresh ink. All of this is a mitzvah, meaning it's a good practice. It's not ma'akeh b'diavad. In other words, b'diavad, if you want to write Hashem's name with fresh ink, and even if you weren't mekadesh it by writing a different letter first, b'diavad it's okay. Siv Chav Gimel. Im matza shechisar ois achas. If you found that you're missing a letter, ein loy takana. There's no way to fix it. If you left out a letter while you're writing Sefer Mezuzah or Tefillin, there's no way to fix it. Because if you're going to go back and fix it, everything written afterwards was Shalai Kesidron. She'em Kain Hoyuksuvin Shalai Kesidron, because then it was written not in order. Upsulin, and it's going to be Pasal Mishum Dechsiv, V'hayu, it says, and it will be B'havayasan Yehu, it has to be the way it appears in the Torah. V'im Yiter Oisachas, but what if I added an extra letter? Can I erase it? Or do we say that then it's also a problem of everything after that is Shalai Kesidron? Yesh Loi Takana Al Yidei Sheyigar Oisa. There is a remedy by scraping it, Imhi B'Soif Teva, Oy B'Tchilasa, if it's at the end of a word or the beginning. But if it's going to be in the middle of the word, Avlam Hi Be'emtza Teva Loi. Because Mishum Dechsha Yigra, when you scrape, Yenira Kishtei Tevos, it's going to look like two words. Says the Mishna Berura, Takana Behashlama. If you left out a letter, there's no way to fix it by filling it in. Umari Shemikana Seif Parsha. So you'll say, what do you mean? There is a takana. I'll fill in the letter and then I'll erase from afterwards. No. We're talking about from where you need to erase till the end, there are names of Hashem that you're not erased. Otherwise, Yigra out of Seif, you could scrape whatever was written. B'havayasan Yehu. We learn out from the Hayu that the Tefillin and Mezuzah have to be written Kesidron. Perish Kaseder Shenechdavos V'Torah Yuksuvim. The order that it's written in the Torah, they have to be written. Ois achas. One letter. If you added one letter, V'im kasav teva yisera. If you wrote one extra word, yigarena, you could scrape out the word. V'yuchal haniach hamakom chalak, and you could leave the place blank. There's no isser. In other words, if let's say you wrote a random word in the Tefillin and the Mezuzah, that's not a problem. So you erase it. Unless, sometimes you could make a resh very long. So if the last letter of the previous word is a letter that you could elongate to fill up the space, then you do that. And the empty space is not a psul kol she'ein b'mekaymoi kashir harevach shebein parsha leparsha, provided that the empty space is not the amount of space of the revach between one parsha and another, shehu kedei tes oisios, which is 9 letters. L'famim yesh takana afilu b'zeh. Sometimes there's a takana even when there's a space of 9 letters. If, let's say, the last letter of the previous word is something that could be elongated to minimize the shiur, the revach of tesoisios. V'yoyser mizeh, even more than this, that in this situation, where the tefillin may become puzzle because of the empty space, then even if at the end of the line before it there is a hey or a kuf, you could elongate the roof of the hey or the kuf in order to minimize the space. Even though if you elongate the kuf or elongate the hay, the leg of the hay and the leg of the kuf will be in the middle and not at the end of the letter. That's not a problem. The Dirshu brings that later on, there's a machlokes rishonim in the letter hey, if the left leg needs to be keneged the Seif Hagag, or even be'emtza. Now it's interesting, he paskins that it does need to be at the end. And the Mishna Berura says if it's not possible to fix, then you can be soymech on the rishonim that hold that it's okay. But here, he holds that you could be lenient because there's no other way to fix it. Because of a prima gadam, the beteva kfula tav yosa limchay kashniya. Let's say you wrote 2 words. In other words, you repeated a word. Mezuzais. You should erase the second one, not the first one. Why? Because the first one, when it was written kedin. The teva rishayna kedin nechtav. The first word was written kahalacha. Ve'im koidem arishayna yesh ois sheyacha lamashchay. However, if before the first word there's a letter that you could elongate, then it's better to erase the first word. Then it's better to erase the first word. Why? In order to be choishes for the shita of Rabbeinu Tam, that a shiur of a parsha is 3 letters, and if you're going to erase the second word, you're going to have more than 3 letter space. But if I erase the first word, I can elongate the last letter before it. So that's what you should do. Sheyigrar, if there's... The Mechaber said that if you wrote an extra letter, you could scrape it if it's at the beginning or end of a word. But if it's in the middle, it's going to be a problem because it will look like 2 words. You say, how could you erase it? But now you're rendering kosher the parsha through erasing. Isn't that chak tuchais? Just like you can't render a letter correct by scraping, how could you render a parsha correct by scraping? No. You're not doing any act in the word itself or the letters. You're just removing something entirely to be machshir so that there's not an extra letter. That's okay, as long as you're not creating words or letters through chak tuchais. But you could be machshir al yedei erasing. Okay, Rabbi Glatstein, thank you very much. We'll continue in Sivkat and Kuf Yud Beis next week. I wish you a wonderful Shabbos. Bracha v'hatzlacha.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.